This is lecture 12 on Kant's philosophy of the self in the Critique of Pure Reason. Well, it's been a while since I posted lecture 11, but the pandemic really affected my life. And today I just give a 12th lecture on the Critique of Pure Reason. Now I talked about the Kant and also Hume. And for Hume, whether what he says in the treatise on human nature or the inquiry concerning human understanding, there really is no connection, no necessary connection between cause and effect. For Hume, it is the subjective habit of the mind which connects cause with effect. So in that sense, that effect is something that just comes after cause in time, and there really is no necessary objective connection. But Kant argues that there is a connection between cause and effect, and there is a law of nature. So what's the difference? For Hume, it is the habit of the subject, but Kant brings in the unity. So for Hume, it is a subjective habit of the mind which unites cause with effect, but Kant brings in the idea of subjective unity. So there is a transcendental apperception, or the unity of the subject, unity of the self for Kant. Okay? And Kant says our knowledge of nature is synthetic a priori. We come to know things in nature a priori. So the question of the Critique of Pure Reason is that how are synthetic judgments knowable a priori? Actually, Kant uses the term a priori and a posteriori adverbially, not adjectively. So for Kant, the term a priori is not adjective, but adverb. That's what you have to know, okay? And when he says a priori knowledge, it's pretty much non-empirical knowledge. But you have to be careful that when Kant says non-empirical knowledge, it's not knowledge of non-empirical objects, namely things in themselves. We come to know things, we come to know appearances of things, we come to know empirical objects non-empirically, but the objects are empirical. So the way we know is non-empirical, but the object itself is empirical. Well, we cannot know God. We cannot know things in themselves. So what you have to know is that when Kant said we have knowledge, we know things a priori, we don't know things in themselves. We don't know non-empirical objects. Just the way of knowing is non-empirical. But the knowledge, the object of knowledge is empirical. So a priori knowledge pretty much, we have non-empirical knowledge of empirical objects. Okay, we don't have knowledge of non-empirical objects such as God. We have non-empirical knowledge of empirical objects. Okay, and we are now when we say we cannot know things in themselves in any way whatsoever, and we come to know appearances or representations by applying them categories. So categories are not applicable to things in themselves. However, there's a question. If there's a hypothetical application of the categories to things in themselves, I mean, categories actually apply to appearances, representations, but do the categories apply to things in themselves? I mean, there's a question about the applicability of the categories to things in themselves. That the answer is we have hypothetical application of the categories to things in themselves, but we don't really have actual application of the categories to things in themselves. Moreover, it's not all that appropriate to say hypothetical application of the categories, because in the foundation of metaphysical morals, Kant talks about the hypothetical imperative and categorical imperative. I mean, he makes a clear distinction between hypothetical imperative and categorical imperative. And H.J. Payton wrote a very good book on the categorical imperative. But hypothetical imperative and the categorical imperative just the opposite. But after the professors said, after professor told the students that there's a clear distinction between hypothetical imperative and categorical imperative, if he says hypothetical application of the categories, the students get confused. See, this is how is that? Okay, hypothetical. According to Kant, there are hypothetical imperative and categorical imperative. They're the exact opposite, but if the professor says categories do not have if the categories have a hypothetical application to the categories, students get confused. I mean, the categories in the critique of pure reason have nothing to do with categorical imperative in the foundation of metaphysical morals. When Kant said the categories in his theory of knowledge, it has nothing to do with theory of morals. But if professor says, well, categories have a hypothetical approach to the category, to things in themselves, students get confused. So it's better to use the term problematic application to the categories. In his lecture of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Professor Bob Wolff said, hypothetical application of the categories. I think he gave us the 9 lectures. He gave us a lecture series on the Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. I mean, it's pretty much his own interpretation of Kant's theory of mental activity he published from Harvard back in 1963. But in lecture 7, maybe lecture 8, I forgot, Professor Bob Wolff said categories have hypothetical application to the things in themselves. But when he taught me and my classmates the Critique of Pure Reason back in the spring of 1984, he said categories have a problematic application to the things in themselves. He used the term problematic back in 1984, but in his lecture on the YouTube, he used the term hypothetical. But it's confusing. It's better to use the term problematic, because if you said hypothetical application of the categories, hey, since hey, professors, you said there's a difference between hypothetical imperative and the categorical imperative. They're totally different, but you now talk hypothetical application of categories. So they get confused. So I think it's better to use the problematic application of the categories. I mean, Professor Bob Wolff, he probably forgot he used the term problematic back in the spring 1984, but I have a pretty good memory, so I remember he said problematic. But in the lecture series of the critique he put on YouTube about 5 years ago, he used the term hypothetical. I think the term problematic is better. And the other thing is, Professor Paul Geyer used the term cognition. He doesn't use the term knowledge. I mean, his new English translation of the Critique of Pure Reason, Professor Geyer used the term cognition instead of knowledge. And that's fine, but at the same time, he uses the term cognize. That's pretty unnatural. I mean, you say, well, we talk about, we say cognition. We can say cognition instead of knowledge. That's fine, but we don't really say cognize. Do you say cognize in your everyday life? For instance, you walk down the street and you see someone say, hi, hey, Mike, or hey, hi, Kathy. He goes or she goes, oh, I didn't recognize it. Oh, I didn't recognize you. But he doesn't say, I didn't cognize you, or she doesn't say, I don't cognize you. I mean, in our daily life, we just say, I didn't recognize you. Well, I could recognize you very well. But they use the term recognize, but they don't use the word cognize. But I think one of the reasons why Professor Geyer used the term cognition instead of knowledge, or cognize instead of know, is he really tries to show that cognition is recognition, and production is reproduction, and presentation is representation. The thing is this. In the critique, Kant talks about the threefold synthesis, okay? Synthesis of apprehension in intuition, synthesis of reproduction in imagination, and synthesis of recognition in a concept. Now, I think Professor Guy really wants to emphasize that cognition is really recognition, or production is really reproduction. For instance, if you want to know the house, there's a house. When you perceive the house in front of you, what do? You look at the roof of the house, and then you look at the chimney of the house. Then you look at the window of the house. I mean, when you perceive, or when you try to know the house in front of you, you see the roof, and you get the image of the roof, and you get the image of the chimney, you get the image of the window. Then you reproduce. See, reproduction. You reproduce the image of the roof. Then you also reproduce the image of the chimney. Then you reproduce the image of the fireplace, or you reproduce the image of the window. According to Leibniz, monads are windowless, but the houses are usually not windowless. Houses have windows. So after you have seen the roof of the house, the chimney of the house, window of the house, the door of the house, you reproduce each one of those images and synthesize them according to rule, and you produce the image of the house, or you produce the image of the whole house. To know, when you come to know the house, or when you in the process of knowing the house, cognizing the house, you are actually reproducing the parts of the house. So reproduction is really production. So to produce the image of the house, you are reproducing the image of the chimney, the image of the roof, the image of the windows, and so on and so forth. So production is really reproduction. Likewise, cognition is recognition. I think that's why Professor Paul Guyer used the term cognition instead of knowledge, or he used the term cognize instead of know. So cognizing is recognizing. Cognition is recognition. Production is reproduction. Also, presentation is representation. Now, up to lecture 11, I use the term appearances, not representation. I mean, well, in a strict sense, there's a difference between representation and appearance, but generally, there really is no difference between appearance and representation. But I didn't use the term representation, but if I sometimes use the term appearance and sometimes use the term representation, you might just get confused. So I just kept on using the one term, appearance. But Kant often uses the term representation. Representation is pretty much appearance. But the thing is, representation is pretty much presentation. In the transcendental aesthetic of the critique, Kant says form of outer sense is space. Form of inner sense is time. So you get the impression that they're separated, and many of the scientists of the 20th century, or even this century, said Kant is outdated because Kant is separating space and time. Kant is treating space and time separately. And in the post-Einsteinian world, since the Albert Einstein advocated the theory of relativity, there really has been no difference between space and time. So the scientists talk about, or physicists talk about space-time instead of space and time respectively. So since Kant says space is a form of outer intuition and time is a form of inner intuition, and he's separating the two, Kant's theory of space and time are really outdated. I don't think so, because space and time are closely connected or inseparable. As I said in chapter 2, inner sense and self in itself, my knowledge, the knowledge of myself, is inseparable from the knowledge of objects in space. Descartes says the mind is better known than the body. No, to know the mind, I have to know all the bodies, including my own bodies, and all the bodies in space. So what we come to know through inner sense and through outer sense are inseparable. That even if you get the impression that Kant is separating space and time, not really. What is presented in time will be represented in space. And that's the knowledge we have. We have knowledge of appearances. We have knowledge of the representations. See? But representation is really presentation. What is presented in time, form of inner sense, will be represented in space. And that's a representation. And we have knowledge of the representation. We have cognition or recognition of that representation. See? So cognition is really recognition. Production is really reproduction. And presentation is really representation. They're closely connected. Actually, some years ago, maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I went to Philadelphia and I called up the philosophy department of the UPenn, and I said I would like to see Professor Geyer, and someone who answered the phone, no, you can't. Can I make an appointment? She said no. okay, if he can't see me this week, can he see me next week? She goes, no, you can't see him because he's not here. So I said, what? Is he on sabbatical? No, he's not on sabbatical. He doesn't teach here anymore. He doesn't teach at UPenn anymore. He went brown. so I got kind of upset. I mean, I had some other friends to see at the Philadelphia, but since I was there, I wanted to make an appointment with Professor Geyer and ask him why he used the term cognition rather than knowledge. Why did he said cognize rather than know? So I just thought he really meant cognition is recognition. So that's why he used the term cognition. I mean, if he just said knowledge, he can't really, you can't really grasp the essence of the Kant's critique of pure reason. But if you said cognition and recognition, it really makes sense. So maybe that's why Professor Geyer used the term cognition instead of knowledge, and he used kind of a awkward term or kind of unnatural word, cognize. I want to ask him about what really he thinks about the use of the term cognition and cognize, but I couldn't see him because he left UPenn and went to Brown, and I haven't got the chance to go to Providence. So that cognition is really recognition, and production is production or reproduction, and presentation is representation. And what is presented in time, the form of inner sense, will be represented in space, and we have knowledge of that representation, i.e. appearance. So, okay, this is the, so I will see you again. I don't know when, but I'm glad I could give lecture 12 on the critique of pure reason. Thank you.